Welcome, everyone. It is truly my pleasure to welcome you to the 10th Marchand Lecture of the Hans van Mierlo Foundation. A special welcome to our speakers of tonight, Glen Weyl, who is with us by live stream from abroad, Mierlo Stichting and Alexander Rinoy-Kan. And to everyone who is watching this program live on YouTube. We are meeting tonight at a time in which the world is in turmoil. The global COVID-19 pandemic has a single cause, a virus, but its consequences are manifold and extensive. And conceivably, much attention is paid to human suffering, to people who lost a loved one, to those who got sick themselves, to the many who worked overtime to control the virus, and to everyone else who struggled, one way or another. But underneath this reality, fundamental political questions continue to rise about our economy, about technology, about our very own democracy. How should we organize markets, production, trade, now that supply chains have failed us? Should we reform capitalism to fight the unequal distribution of wealth and power in today's society? Are we taking irreversible steps towards giving governments and tech companies too much control of our data? And can our democracy still function in a time in which the executive branch of government is more dominant than ever before in recent history? Considering these questions, one could say that many of them are not entirely new. Even before the pandemic, these were matters to address. One could say the pandemic merely functions as a burning glass. Just as a burning glass concentrates the sun rays to heat up an exposed surface, COVID-19 concentrates a variety of fundamental political questions into a singular heated debate. A debate in which we cannot afford ourselves to look for easy answers, but in which we should examine the root of the matter. And that is why we are here tonight. With the Marchand Lectures, the Hans van Mierlo Foundation invites experts from around the world to reflect on values that are vital to liberalism. The central topic of this evening, the future of capitalism, is connected to many of the questions that became all the more urgent due to the pandemic. Urgent for everyone, but especially for liberals who have a long and complex history of both championing capitalism and markets and introducing legislation to restrict them. That is why I'm extremely proud that Glen Weyl was so kind to accept our invitation to be the keynote speaker for this year's lecture. The program was originally scheduled for March 25, and Glen was invited before anyone had heard of COVID. But we could not have wished for a more fitting speaker at this time. Radical Markets, the book Weyl co-authored with Chicago Law School professor Eric Posner, was named one of the best books of 2018 by The Economist. In the tradition of 19th century radical political economists, Weyl and Posner deconstruct capitalism and build it up again from the ground onwards. And in doing so, they introduce a very controversial idea in today's political debate, that we should expand the role of markets instead of subdue them. Since its publication, the matters they discuss in their book have become all the more relevant, and Glen's star has continued to rise. He founded Radical Change, an international movement aimed at realizing the ideas in his book, and he was involved in providing alternative responses against COVID-19 in the United States. And that is why, Glen, I'm delighted to welcome you to this year's Marchand Lecture. I'm also very pleased that we have two guests with us in Tivoli who will respond to Weyl's lecture. Mierlo Stichting, one of the leading Dutch thinkers in the field of technology, and Alexander Rinoy-Kan, who has a long and distinguished career in the field of social and economic affairs as a professor, board chairman, and senator for D66. Dear audience, lastly, I would like to ask everyone here tonight to follow the COVID instructions such as social distancing. We are very pleased to host a real event once again, but doing so means every one of us has a responsibility. Please follow the instructions of the staff and let's make sure everyone can have a pleasant and a safe evening. I would now like to give the floor to our host for the evening, Afke Groen, researcher at the Van Mierlo Foundation, Afke will introduce our speakers and moderate the Q&A at the end of the evening. Afke, the floor is yours. Thank you all.
Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone here with us in Utrecht, TivoliVredenburg. Welcome to all of you on the live stream in our virtual audience. And a very special and warm welcome to Glen Weyl, who is on the other side of the Atlantic, and to Alexander Rinoy-Kan and Marleen Sticker, who are here with us as speakers today. I have the honor to be your moderator for this evening, and I will kick off with some announcements about the practical organization of tonight's event. Of course, Glen will be the first to speak tonight as our keynote speaker of the Marchand lecture. He will be followed by Marleen Sticker and Alexander Rinoy-Kan in this order. We would very much like to ask you, our audience, to ask questions to our speakers. If you are watching the live stream, you can submit your questions on Twitter using the hashtag Marchantlezing in Dutch, or on YouTube using the comment section below the live stream. Feel free to post your questions immediately during the lectures already, whenever your question comes to mind. We will, however, only get to the questions by the end of the speakers, so after the last speaker, Alexander Rinoy-Kan, when we will have a panel discussion and a Q&A session. And one of our team members will hand over the questions on a piece of paper from the live stream. Now, if you are here with us in Tivoli today, of course, you can also ask questions. You can simply raise your hand. I will point at you. There will be a bit more light so I can see you. And then you can state your question out loud. This is a bit of a balancing act between not too softly, then I can't hear you, and not too loud because we can't shout given the COVID restrictions. Please don't raise your hand immediately when you have a question, but wait until the Q&A session. If you really can't resist the temptation to immediately post your questions, feel free to also use Twitter, for those of you who have a Twitter account. But if you use your phone, don't forget to put it in silent mode. It is with very great pleasure that I can now introduce our keynote speaker. Born and raised in San Francisco, Glen Weyl is a former academic, and he's a political economist and social technologist at Microsoft. He's also the founder and chair of Radical Exchange, which is an NGO pushing for economic and political reform to build a sustainable and more coherent alternative for capitalism in the face of growing inequality and polarization. Together with University of Chicago scholar Eric Posner, he published Radical Markets, Uprooting Capitalism and Democracy for a Just Society, a book pushing bold new ideas for economic reform to counter growing inequality and stagnation. And I'm sure that he will tell you all about this tonight. Glen, on the other side of the Atlantic, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's a true honor to be addressing this party and this foundation. When I was just graduating high school, as an 18-year-old, or actually I guess I was 17 at the time, my father took me on a trip to the Netherlands, the first time I ever visited. And I, being an avid rollerblader, took out the rollerblades I'd brought across the Atlantic with me and started rollerblading around the capital through a park where I, for the first time, encountered the green flyers of a political movement called D66, which identified itself as social liberal, something that has a very different meaning in the United States and that I'd never really heard of before. And that moment was a critical juncture in my political awakening to the possibility of a vision of markets and freedom that was consistent with understanding the critiques of capitalism that are inherent to socialism. And today I'll present the latest step on that journey, which builds on the book that Afka and Cohen mentioned, and is hopefully a tribute to all that you all have contributed to my own development. So I think that the COVID pandemic has reminded us all powerfully of the social foundations of the freewheeling market economies that neoliberalism has often held up. New York City, sort of the global center of capitalism, famously shut down because of its inability to deal with the public health crisis created by the pandemic. And property values that were so famously high there have fallen nearly in half because of the inability to support the public infrastructure for so many years that is now crucial to the city being able to operate at all. On the other hand, in much of Asia, where there was much greater investment in that public infrastructure, maybe with an occasional mask, capitalism and markets and all the elements of the liberal society largely go on unimpeded. So this is one example, and a really sharp one, of the way in which what we think of as markets, what we think of as individual efforts, constantly rely on social infrastructure that makes them possible. And that fact of how deeply connected we all are by things beyond markets and that make markets possible, I think has really come home to the public. Support for capitalism has been gradually eroding, especially among the young in wealthy countries. On the left, we see that capitalism, even last year, was viewed positively by about the same number of people of my generation as socialism was, even in the United States. And yet this gradual bankruptcy of capitalism in the public mind has turned into a very sudden one in the minds of so many people with the devastation wrought by COVID. Today, almost 3/4 of Americans believe that our current form of capitalism is insufficient to ensure the greater good of society, to produce the kind of society I want for the next generation, or to work for the average American. And these are not just sentiments. There's a profound logic here, which is deeply related to the logic of the way that public goods are core to creating everything that capitalism is about. The basic theory of capitalism is that competitive markets are able to set prices that reflect marginal productivity and therefore lead to the efficient allocation of resources. This is the most basic set of ideas behind justifying capitalism, from Adam Smith through Leon Walras to modern economics. And yet this most basic set of ideas relies on a critical assumption, something called decreasing returns. This is the notion that, for example, in a factory, if you only have a certain number of machines, the more workers you hire, eventually, the less productive adding an additional worker is. Because eventually the factory gets crowded, there aren't enough machines for all these workers to work on, and the last worker is not able to do very much. And if workers are then paid based on this marginal productivity, the productivity of the last worker, then the total amount you have to pay all workers will be less than the factory produces, allowing the factory to run a profit while still paying its workers competitively. This is pictured on the left here in this little diagram, which shows that if output is a concave, decreasing returns function of how many workers you have, then if you pay workers their marginal product, which is defined by this tangent line, this dotted line here, and you trace that back to the x-axis, to the y-axis, you'll see that the total amount you have to pay to workers is less than the amount that the firm produces, and therefore you earn a profit. However, the reality of much of the world is very different from this. It's not like the factory that eventually gets crowded. It's like the city, which is more vibrant the more people are in it. This idea is called increasing returns. And it's one where the more people that you put into a place, the more people join a network, the more people participate in a digital service, the greater value it adds to everyone. When we have increasing returns, the production function looks like pictured on the left. So rather than being concave, it's convex up. And so it accelerates the more people there are. If you then try to pay people their marginal product, you're going to have to pay everyone more in total than you produce, because the marginal contribution of every person is greater than in total than the total production overall. And you know, just a very concrete example of this is, think of all the things that contribute to happiness in your life: the sewers, electricity, the internet. Imagine how much you'd be willing to pay to keep each one of these things. Add all those up, maybe you'd be willing to pay, according to some people, $20,000 to keep the internet, maybe $30,000 to keep toilets. Eventually, you're way above the amount of money you make every year. That's because every individual component that comes together to make modern life is worth more in total than there is money out there to divide among them. And this basic idea of increasing returns, that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, that together we can achieve more than each of us can individually, is the heart of modern civilization. And yet, under capitalism, it leads to paradoxical results. The classic example of this is software. Software, once you've created it, making it available to one more person has almost no cost. This means that the marginal cost falls dramatically and there are big increasing returns. And that leaves us with two choices. Either we can put this software under the monopolistic control of one company, like many people thought Microsoft was in the 1990s, my employer. And that leads to restrictions of access. It leads to a huge concentration of power. The other option is to just make this publicly available as open source softwares. But in that case, there's nothing to fund the product in the first place. And this happens with lots of open source. Here I've shown a picture of the fact that many of the fundamental protocols that underlie the internet, things like SSL that protects your data online, are developed by people who get essentially no compensation. Wikipedia, it's widely calculated, accounts for about 30% of the value that people get from Google searches, and yet it has 1/1000th of the funding of Google, all from donations. And yet, while capitalism just doesn't work for these increasing returns phenomena, these increasing returns phenomena are at the core of everything that supposedly come out of capitalism. Cities, from which the very term bourgeois arises, from which capitalism sprung, were only possible because of all the sanitation, the sewers, and the measures that made it possible to live in the cities without dying of disease. And we've clearly seen that recently. And those were public investments. Those were collective investments. Factories depend on large-scale organization. And to really spread, they grew out of unions and out of the collective organization of large-scale production. Electricity was a novelty found by Benjamin Franklin and an interesting invention of Thomas Edison for the light bulb, but it didn't actually affect productivity and growth until we built electrical grids, investments made by the public and managed through utilities. And the internet is the ultimate example of an increasing returns phenomena where there's a huge amount of value generated, and yet it's almost impossible to fund it through any sort of charge that wouldn't destroy most of its value. So the world is just filled, everything in the history of capitalism that we celebrate as coming out of capitalism is in fact the result of collective organization of these increasing returns phenomena. And this same issue is really at the root of almost every problem we're facing today. Because while these increasing returns phenomena are ever more present in our technological world, at the same time, we've leaned more and more into a neoliberal doctrine, which says that markets, private markets, can take care of it all, when at the very core of what makes markets work is the opposite of increasing returns. Increasing returns are at the core of why we have such a concentration of power in the hands of a very small number of tech companies. They are the essence of why we're not protecting the planet from destruction, because that's a good that affects everyone with no discrimination, regardless of what you contribute. It's a classic example of increasing returns. Information goods are a classic example of increasing returns. That's the reason why we don't have funding for the high quality information that things like Wikipedia, investigative journalists, et cetera, provide. And we have instead a proliferation of misinformation that overwhelms it. And they're at the core of pandemics. We all know that protecting the public health is far cheaper, far more effective as a way of having a functioning society than every person getting treated once they get the disease, or every person's individual business having to take measures to test people. And thus, the theory of capitalism, this idea of efficient markets, efficient prices, decreasing returns, cannot account for everything that capitalism claims as its successes. It can't account for electricity and the benefits that brought. It can't account for mass production and the benefits that brought. It can't account for internet or digital technology or radio or the telegraph or railroads or any of these other increasing returns goods that are at the core of what has made capitalism productive. Now, of course, the alternative that we hear held up is the nation state. If things are collective, let's nationalize them, let's organize them collectively. But the fundamental problem is that the nation state is hundreds of years old, based on very specific geographic boundaries and languages, which are not relevant to most of the issues that we're facing today. The majorities within a nation state are not the collective impacted by most of the problems that we face. Think of the Amazon River. This is a river that crosses 5 different countries and a relatively small portion of each of those 5 countries. So if you try to collectively organize the management of the Amazon by nation states, you have 5 states each fighting to take their part and leave the costs to others. And at the same time, the people who actually subsist on that area, who are close to the land, often indigenous groups, are oppressed by each of their countries because they're small minorities within it. We organize many things at the city level to try to deal with some of these problems. And yet cities are not a good way to line things up either with the complexity of the modern world that's increasingly diverse. We know that Black and brown people in the United States are far disproportionately victimized by police and singled out for incarceration in a drug war that is voted for by majorities of white people in the United States, while the brown people of Central America get shot in the streets in the crossfire of the drug war that pays for that American habit. Nation states just don't line up with the international, subnational, and often cross-national nature of the collective problems we face today. So we have to do better. And that's the essence of the idea of radical exchange. We have to move beyond capitalism and the state as a dichotomy to find new forms of collective organization. We have to move beyond individualism and collectivism to understand that what really makes the individual is the intersection of all the different collectives that they're part of. We need to oppose either isolation or a totalizing notion of the state, and instead foster emergent and responsive social organizations that allow us to align progress in social innovation, reorganization of our societies, with the technological innovation, so we can keep up with the progress of technology to always have that collective organization of it. That to do that, we need to understand that individuals flow out of communities and communities flow out of individuals, that we need to empower people politically with equal voice, but allow for the flexibility that everyone participates in different communities. We need to allow for common ownership, but not by a nation state, but rather by the diverse and overlapping communities that things pertain to. We need to democratize capitalism. We need to turn corporations into democracies, and yet we need to allow the state to be more flexible. We need to have federalism and subsidiarity, yes, but beyond geography. There are so many different groups to which things matter, whether they be ethno-racial groups, gender, people who are interested in particular performers, et cetera, et cetera. And to do that, we need to allow for constantly changing social forms and allow our political and social institutions to respond to those changing forms. We need to move beyond the division between politics and economics to an integrated understanding of political economy. And we need to achieve this not by overthrowing the existing system violently, but by eroding it and taming the excesses of the existing system. Okay, so let me try to give you some examples of just concrete formal designs that try to implement some of these ideas. One of these I developed with Vitalik Buterin, who's the founder of the Ethereum blockchain, the biggest blockchain project, and Zoe Hitzig, who's a Harvard PhD student, a philosopher and poet. And this is called Quadratic Finance. And it builds off an idea that's quite familiar, which is that often in providing public goods, whether they be the funding of campaigns or the funding of media, there are public institutions or philanthropists who provide matching funds for individual charitable contributions to create organizations. For example, there's an organization called Public Spaces in the Netherlands that's trying to create public media in collaboration with the government and is using this type of a model. And it's used for funding open source software, as in Gitcoin grants. And they actually use this particular design we propose. So one example of this is that in the city of New York, if you contribute money to a politician, up to $100, you'll get matched 6 for 1 in that contribution to magnify the power of small donors. Now, these matching schemes try to have a democratic character. They match more small contributions and contributions to candidates who have a lot of supporters. And that's the basic idea of quadratic finance. The notion is that the government or governments or international organizations, philanthropists provide matching funds so that the amount of money received by a charity or by some crowdsourced, crowdfunded institution is equal to the square of the sum of the square roots that individuals contribute to it. So what that means is that as the number of contributors increases, the amount of funding received grows as the square of the number of contributions. And yet, if an individual contributes a lot, if it's mostly contributed by a single person, it doesn't get much additional funding. And the logic here is that if you're a small part of a large public good, you have an incentive to free ride. You don't want to contribute. These matching funds make up for that and allow for the small voices to have just as much incentive to contribute as the large people who usually dominate charity and a lot of politics and so forth. Now, there's a natural, that allows for really the creation precisely of these emergent different democratic communities that matter to parts of the population rather than everything being driven just by a majority of a fixed population. And any project could add itself to the list of things that want to be funded within some purview. So it could be you could fund journalism this way rather than having the government give out grants or fund state media. You could have these matching funds and individual contributions determine the texture of voices we hear in the media. But then there's a question, where do all these matching funds come from? And there's a very deep principle in economic theory that gives a quite clear answer. I'm sure you're all aware that parts of the country that have very strong public goods, that have great schools, that have beautiful canals, places to bike, these are places where property values are very high. And in fact, when you invest in a school or bike lanes or whatever, that will lead to an increase in property values. And there's something called the Henry George theorem, named after one of my heroes, Henry George, which says that if you take the money that comes from the increase in these values, that's enough to fund the creation of any public service that's worth creating. And there's a more general idea behind this, which is that there are some parts of the economy, like the value of land, but also like the limited time of the most talented people or the greatest athletes or whatever, that have decreasing returns. And they will tend to make a profit. And those profits will absorb the value that comes from the increasing returns. So Google absorbs the value in its scarce advertising that comes from the internet, all the value created on the internet. The finance industry absorbs lots of the value that comes from the web of international interactions. If we can extract that value, if we can tax away that value, we have the foundations to provide the matching funds to support all of these increasing returns activities that generate the value in the first place. And that process of sort of taking these sinks of value and redistributing the money back to support the public goods that underlie them is really the most fundamental principle, I think, in economic policy. It's by getting that flow constantly going around, you basically create almost a superconductor that leads the economy to levitate because you remove the frictions that stop that flow. And the key problem then is, how do we tax these areas without killing the benefits that they bring? And there was a quite brilliant insight about this, which was built on Henry George's ideas, but was developed further by Sun Yat-sen, who was the founder of the Chinese Revolution, as well as by Arnold Harberger, a University of Chicago economist, and was later adopted in Taiwan and to a certain extent in Estonia. And the idea was that you can use a tax to actually make the economy more dynamic. So I'll read you Harberger's words. He said, if you have to make a base for taxes, adopt criteria that determine the true economic value. The solution the economist offers is simple and direct. Allow the owner to declare a value himself, make these values public, and oblige the owner to sell his property to any person willing to pay the declared value. The system is simple and creates incentives even beyond those existing in the market for assets to be employed in their most productive economic use. So this actually overcomes the way in which private property creates a monopoly control over blocks of a city, over radio spectrum, over the rights to extract natural gas or oil, and turns instead every asset into something that's constantly flowing, constantly recycling its value back to the economy. Now, that's a very bold idea, but it's one that would actually allow us to dramatically increase markets, dramatically increase efficiency, at the same time as expropriating much of private wealth to fund these public goods. But even if we don't want to go that far, there's a million steps that we can take on the way. For example, international corporations right now are usually thought of either as let the private sector, let the market take care of it, or the national government should regulate. But there's actually an alternative. We could democratize corporations by forcing them themselves to become democracies of their stakeholders. It's actually very funny that we always think of democracy associated just with the geography, but there are many churches that have long been run democratically. Couldn't we, through the power of governments working together, force corporations to actually be accountable to their stakeholders, force the Facebooks of the world to be managed by the people who they hold power over, in the same way that people of a nation have sovereignty over their government. And we can use antitrust policies as a tool for this. Some of my colleagues like Michelle Meager and Colin Meyer have been thinking about exactly this idea, that rather than using antitrust to break up corporations, we could use it to force them to give voice to the people that they hold power over, whether those be their consumers or their workers. And these are just a few of many ideas. We've been working on new systems for voting that allow much greater flexibility in minority voice, new systems for migration that empower communities to bring in migrants, new approaches to antitrust based on the ideas I was talking about, and also limiting the power of financial investors, new ways of governing data by organizing it into data trusts, data collectives, where people together collectively bargain almost like a union for the value of their data. New systems for deliberation at scale, where we use artificial intelligence, clustering algorithms, et cetera, to help people have a large-scale democratic conversation. And new approaches to data systems themselves that are based on having an understanding that almost all data about us is actually pertains to people other than us. And yet we're at the intersection of many of those communities, and that it's that intersectional nature that makes our identity. And while these all sound like very bold ideas, these are very much playing out. They're at the core of how Taiwan has led a digital democratic revolution. They're being used to fund open source projects. We have more than 100 local groups around the world, including a very active one in Amsterdam, that are working with Radical Exchange. The government of Colorado has implemented a number of these projects, and we're continuing to work with them on more. Taiwan is one of the most inspiring examples of this. They've really brought together many of these elements: data collaboratives, large-scale democratic deliberation on a digital platform where a quarter of the country are monthly active users participating in shaping the governance of their country. They're playing out in places like Estonia, where land taxes, like I described, are a core part of how they raise funds. They're playing out in Colorado, where quadratic funding has been used to support local businesses during the COVID pandemic. Quadratic voting, this voting tool I was talking about, is being used by the legislature to determine its budget and by the executive to resolve difficult issues. And perhaps not surprisingly, the countries that are most advanced in implementing these tools have also performed the best in the pandemic, both having the fewest lives lost. Taiwan lost about 10 times fewer people per capita than mainland China did, and at half the economic impact as well. Estonia within Europe has been by far the strongest performer, using its digital democracy as a way to empower people to collectively organize to address these problems fastly, efficiently, but with close attention to citizen voice. And without a story like this, people are going to increasingly look towards a bureaucratic authoritarianism, the story of China and its success in addressing the COVID pandemic. But the reality is that while Chinese technology did a fair job of addressing the pandemic, the far more powerful technology is the one that actually builds it into the core of democracy, into the dynamism that democratic systems make possible. And that's a message we have to take to those who in Silicon Valley would export the Chinese surveillance state through their form of surveillance capitalism. Instead of surveillance state, instead of surveillance capitalism, we need participatory democratic systems, building off these innovations, learning from the examples of these newer democracies that show us how to evolve what it means to be a liberal society. And those are the stories that I hope that you'll tell with us. We work tirelessly at Radical Exchange with artists, game designers, authors, to help people imagine a future like this, comic book writers, art galleries. One of my favorite and the best-selling strategy games of all time, Civilization, has incorporated quadratic voting into its mechanics. Our CEO at Radical Exchange is an artist. But we also act, we live using these principles. In Bangalore, India, we work to reform the water system using these ideas. We use them to fund open source projects. We play games in our community around it. We organize student groups around these things all around the world. And we work with politicians around the planet, from Claudia Lopez, the first gay mayor of a Latin American city, hopefully soon with you all in the D66, with center-right politicians like Michelle Rempel from the Canadian Conservative Party, one of their most popular members, and Danielle Allen, one of the most important leaders on COVID in the United States. And I hope that many of you will be inspired by this to join with us to, in the Netherlands and beyond, build a new future that recognizes that we need markets, we need flexibility, we need dynamism, and to make those work, we need democracy to penetrate all of them. Thank you so much.
Glen, thank you so very much for your very enlightening, highly original perspective on capitalism, and for your radical, indeed, ideas for how to build a better future. Before I give the floor to the next speaker, I wanted to ask you a brief question, as our next speaker, Mierlo Stichting, is a leading thinker in the Netherlands and beyond on technology. And she has often warned against the hazards of the digital world as it is currently designed, not least when it comes to questions about the control of our data or questions about who owns our data. And clearly, you also expressed concerns about this. And that's why I wanted to ask you if you could reflect a little bit more on do we need to reconcile the implementation or the urgency of the implementation of your radical ideas, which often seem to rely on major digital innovations, major digital platforms? Do we need to reconcile that urgency of implementing your radical ideas with the urgency to also fix the internet?
That's a great question. So, you know, thank you so much, Avka. So to come back to the early part of the presentation where I said that we need to focus both on building alternatives to the current society and restraining its worst excesses. And I think we need to balance between those. Things like quadratic finance are bold visions for the future, but they're not things that we can implement at large scale immediately. At the same time, we're on rapid course to concentrate so much power into so few hands that those experiments may not have the opportunity to live if they're choked off by that concentration of power. So I think we need to simultaneously experiment, live in different ways, build different ways of imagining our society, and use the power of the state to restrain the worst excesses of corporations, and at the same time use the power of corporations to restrain the worst excesses of ethno-national states, as we've seen in the United States and even in some parts of Europe. So I think we need to always be checking and balancing the system at the macro level to allow the micro level transformative experiments to bubble their way up.
All right. Thank you so much, Glen. We will get back to you after our next two speakers for the Q&A session and the panel discussion. So I will see you in a bit. It is my pleasure to announce our next speaker, Mierlo Stichting. She is the director and founder of Waar, which is an organization that lives in the overlap between technology, innovation, and art. Through research, WAAG aims to provide individuals with the technological tools to achieve self-fulfillment and empowerment. Marleen is also the founder of the Digitale Stad, or the Digital City in English, placing her at the absolute cusp of the internet as one of the very first providers. In 2021, she will join the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences as a professor of practice. And in 2019, she wrote the book Het Internet is Stuk, or The Internet is Broken, in which she discussed the rise and the ruin of the internet, and finally discusses how it can possibly be saved. Marleen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I almost can't see. I'm privileged that I'm in a real space with real people, but I almost can't see you. So it could also be streamed now, I think. It could be maybe later I will see you. Yeah, thank you so much for being invited. And it's quite an interesting book to reflect on, and especially also the presentation, the lecture just being told by Glen. And I had some, it took me some time to find my way into the book, but also in the thinking, because some of the ideas feel very, very comfortable, and I feel like, this is something I could tell myself, and sometimes I felt really totally lost. And I hope I will explain that to you. So I would go beyond markets. Preparing myself for this lecture, reading Radical Markets of Glen Weyl, I was getting more and more puzzled by the doggedly effort to restore the belief in markets. If we agree that capitalism is in crisis, is not delivering on its promises, and that optimizing for shareholders is endangering our future on this planet, why not conclude that we have to structure our societies around something else than markets? The dominance of markets is the heart of the problem, and by tinkering with them won't solve that. If we agree that free markets do not exist because any governance or rules mean there is an intervention, also the lack of it, and then advocating for a truly free market or a freer free market is a contradiction in termini, even if you put the term radical in front of it and auction everything away. By sticking to the concept of markets, you build your societies around the fundamental flaw of markets, and that is, it defines everything as a transaction. That is the true nature of the problem. Capitalism defines value on the basis of transactions and the notion that everything has a price. That is the cultural bias, the capitalist worldview, and it's the root of the problem. We are more than that. We are not homo economicus, the rational man that is optimizing for his own interest, nudged by price opportunities. We are social beings that care for our families, friends, neighbors, for people, for other species, for the happiness or the lack thereof of future generations. We genuinely share and help each other out. Cooperation is a survival strategy for humankind, not competition. We are not defined by transactions, but by relations. It is what we experienced during the COVID pandemic. We realized that social contact is essential for a happy life. And unfortunately, our current models, spreadsheets and policies are based on the necessity of economic growth and force people to operate as calculators. To find a new perspective and to add an enormous human potential to the equation, I propose that we start to acknowledge that humanity started with commons. Our earth is a commons, our natural resources by default were commons. Human artifacts like language are commons, knowledge is a commons. The study of the commons, its governance and its design can help us to come up with new perspectives on how societies can organize value creation and resources. Commons as a core principle that defines what markets are allowed to do. Commons is a shared domain or resource governed by laws and regulation that are rooted in values agreed to in a social contract. These commonly held rules and boundaries which guarantee certain liberties and limit certain types of activity. Generally, commons are thought of as being open and accessible. However, there are always limits to their openness and accessibility. That is why there is no anarchy, no tragedy of the commons, as Elinor Ostrom, Nobel Prize winner for economy in 2008, described and studied and wrote in her historic study. I believe that commons is very well aligned with the concept of vrijheid in gebondenheid that marks the liberal agenda of D66. I also believe that commons is in the book, in the radical market book, but not being described in such a way. If humanity wants to survive on this planet, it has to find back a systemic and practical implementation of the commons. Commons as in how we deal with natural resources, land, energy, water, data, artificial intelligence, and in the way we spend billions of euros that we lend from future generations for funding of key enabling technologies. The commons is not the state. We do not have to make the choice between either market or state. Commons are cooperative structures that exist aside of state and market. So I believe what is being described just now as a dichotomy, we don't have to think about either or. The commons can be something new, it's old and can be restructured as another organizational principle in our societies. So how can we collectively organize, a collective organization play a role in technology or collective production, as Glen told us? We already agree on the fact that the design of markets is not neutral. So it is the design of technology. It is not neutral. It is not just a means to an end that can be used wisely or badly. Technology has already intention, behavior, and interest in its conception, especially in code and data. Data is not neutral. Algorithms are not neutral. We have to live with the fact that we humans are biased by nature, and so are our cultural technical artifacts. It is our privilege and our social economic status that we do not have to experience it. But the people that are excluded from public services or a safe living environment because of surveillance technology, predictive policing, or profiling are on the receiving end. Computer says no is for them no joke, but the difference between a job or no job, insurance or no insurance, life or death. Those who own technology define the rules of society. In fact, the fact that technology is not neutral has been ignored by politicians because they were made believe that they were too old or too stupid to understand it. A critical understanding of technology is not part of our educational upbringing. Tech education is mainly there to optimize the workforce for the industry and to create human capital, humans as resources for the job market. Political parties should engage with technology because it is defining our future. We live in a technocracy. We outsourced all our core societal processes to the platforms of technology companies that do not obey to our rule of law. We sacrifice democracy and the common good on the altar of tech giants. But it's not too late. One of the good things that came of the corona crisis is the open and vivid discussion on internet protocols, that what lies underneath the surface of what people experience as the internet. With the design of the COVID apps, a discussion on the political nature of protocols reached the democratic arenas. The battle was between PEP-PT and DP3T. It's already very funny to hear all kind of people expressing this kind of terms and then understanding what it means. So PEP-PT was a centralized data storage, and DP3T is a distributed protocol where the data is stored on your own device. It even affected the way Apple and Google implemented the proximity measurement on its operating systems. So I think this was one of the first real open discussions on protocols that engaged people beyond the internet experts and the technologists. It showed that democratic ruling, open processes, and public engagement can help to create technology that has public values inside. If we want to reclaim our democracy and our common resources, we have to reclaim the public domain in the digital field. Weyl mentioned some examples of data commons, and I believe we are aligned in the need to see software as a commons, as open source or open data or data commons, as he already mentioned. It is therefore very strange that he suggests in his book, Chapter 5, Data as Labor, to ask the tech platforms to pay a price for the data that it steals from us. It is an example how a market tunnel view brings you on the opposite of what you want to achieve. If we want to have sovereign states, countries, cities, and citizens, we should not allow tech platforms to build up profiles, trade personal data, peek into our houses, or influence our political and public spheres. It's that simple. We have rules for that. We have laws. We can make new laws, like the utility platform law of the US Senator Elizabeth Warren, that breaks up big tech companies. We just have to enforce them. So let's not surrender to the terminology of markets that defines everything as a transaction. I'm not sure if it's progressive capitalism to ask for a fair price if you have been scrutinized. Strangely enough, also the Social Democrats cannot quit the market labor system thinking and initiated a data union, as if we are all involuntary work for the tech companies and now want to have our compensation. Let's be clear. Our lives are not transactional. The personal data that represents and defines us is not transactional. We have laws on the integrity of the human body and the sovereignty of the individual. In our country, we do not have to trade part of our bodies for access to fundamental rights. We do not have to pay our taxes with part of our kidneys. What counts for the human body counts also for personal data. On the internet, we now only have corporate private spaces, which the owner can manage as they please to the exclusion of others, and where the space is managed as a productive asset, rather than managed as a personal good, as in the case with personal private spaces. In each of these senses, space is not purely physical, but might also refer to radio frequencies or bandwidth. Moreover, there is an increasing trend of corporate private digital spaces entering into spaces which were previously personal private spaces, or digital public spaces. Internet of Things devices which store, analyze, and sell data regarding a person's home activities. Political discourse which is owned by Facebook, curated and moderated by its employees and algorithms. A digital identity account accessed through a Google browser which tracks the person's online activity. So how to reclaim our digital integrity? By constituting an open digital public space that enforces rules and governance on technology, data, algorithms, artificial intelligence. A public space where the integrity of people is respected, a commons that is free from market dynamics. You mentioned public spaces, which is actually one of those endeavors to get to that point. We have to think differently about how we spend the billions of future generations for technological innovation. For example, the way we invest in artificial intelligence research and healthcare. Are we really going to spend billions now to generate patents and intellectual property, to find ourselves in a position that we have to spend again billions of tax money to companies that use the public funded knowledge for extreme profits? We can be smarter. If we spend public money, we create common resources that cannot be privatized. In this way, artificial intelligence is in this scenario, artificial intelligence is open and therefore accountable, an open resource. Companies can create services on top of it, but they cannot own the technology or the data. Listening to Glen Weyl, I believe there is a radical agenda he is suggesting. I'm just not sure if his core proposal to see everything as a market and data as labor are the best concepts to illustrate his narrative. We need to implement and enforce public values and rights which protect sovereignty, personal data ownership, privacy in online spaces, to ensure these principles both online and in our physical lives. These values and rights can form the basis for digital public spaces where people are citizens rather than consumers, where relations rule, not transactions. That is the radical agenda for our digital future.
Marleen, thank you so much for your critical view on the design of the digital world as it currently stands. You already mentioned that we should try to stay away from the language of the market when we talk about these issues. And as you know, there have been developments also towards the creation of data labor unions. Also in the Netherlands with the launch of the Data Vakbond, I believe it was in 2018. Radical markets, as you mentioned, likewise talks about data as labor and labor unions of data workers. So what do you think about this development? Is there also a more positive side to this, or how can we tweak this so that it might help to design a better digital world?
Well, as I just said, I think that by defining data as labor and that we want to be compensated for it, we make a big mistake because we start to use the terms of the market to talk about something which should not be part of transactions. So our personal sphere should not be part of the transactional world. It is a personal sphere. And since we lost this whole notion, if we think that everything is a market, then yeah, of course, data is also a market. But we have to, that's why I introduced another language, because and that's my problem also is sticking with the terminology of markets and saving the markets and make them even more free. Or I think that the story about, well, capitalism, well, let's save capitalism from capitalism and let's keep, but we don't introduce a new idea about what the public is, what the public good is, what the commons is. And it doesn't restore the idea that the integrity of the person. Yeah. So that I think is dangerous in sticking to the language of markets. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I am going to introduce, and also we will see Marleen again at the Q&A session and our panel. I'm going to introduce the final speaker of today. You probably all know him. Alexander Renoy-Can was born and bred in The Hague, but he has studied in academic institutions all over the Netherlands and beyond, including Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Berkeley, California. And for a few years, he was the chairperson of the Society for Dutch Entrepreneurs, VNO, and he also served as the chair of the Dutch Social and Economic Council. Alexander Renoy-Can, up until last year, was a member of the Dutch Senate for D66, and he's also involved in several cultural organizations and businesses, such as the Prins Bernhard Culture Foundation and the Bali in Amsterdam. Alexander, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, capitalism is in trouble. Capitalism is in deep trouble. And I think that will not come as a surprise to this audience, both here and at home. What is remarkable to me, and frankly almost too good to be true, is to hear from Glen Weyl that by now 3/4 of the US population, 3/4, appears to agree with that assessment. And indeed, as some of you may have seen, just a few months ago, America's blue chip CEOs jointly came out in favor of the stakeholder rather than the shareholder enterprise model. Surprise. Wall Street meets the Rhineland. We really live in revolutionary times. Ladies and gentlemen, capitalism's troubles are many-fold. Excessive inequality of income and wealth would be highest on my own list. Markets function increasingly poorly. Labor has lost the race against capital, and public goods are underproduced. None of these issues are completely new, but jointly, I think we would all agree they are pretty disturbing. Now, unlike Glen Weyl, I do not view the tension, as he formulated it, between increasing and decreasing returns to scale as the core problem of capitalism. If a market does not deliver, and many of them don't, then to me, market design is the most likely culprit. Market design, that is the sum total of the rules and regulations and constraints that the market players have to live by. And I think, to me at least, that is also the main message that I derive from Glen Weyl's remarkable and original book, Radical Markets, co-authored with Eric Posner and briefly referred to in his lecture. Radical markets. I have to confess, I really, really liked that title. And I am sure I'm not the only one here. Our political party has always had an appetite for the term radical. We love it. And indeed, for a short while, as I'm sure many of you remember, D66 advertised itself as the radical middle, the radicale midden. But of course, when the Christian Democrats started to use exactly the same label, and let us be generous and assume purely by coincidence, we backed off right away. So radicals we may have been, perhaps we still are, but aggressive defenders of the title we were not. Now, in recent years, radicalism in politics has unfortunately become associated with intolerance and dogmatism. And that is a very unfortunate connotation. To me, it should certainly not stand for some kind of immutable creed, but on the contrary, for a permanent willingness to re-examine and reassess the very roots of one's political beliefs. The roots. That is, after all, where the word radical comes from. And so it is in that spirit that I have read and really enjoyed Radical Markets, the book. I strongly agree with the author that capitalism is man-made and not God-given. Man-made. And so, in a sense, it's simple. If we don't like what we see, and we don't, then it is up to all of us to rethink the model, redebate the model, and ultimately it's up to democratically elected politicians to change the model and to redesign the model. And if you look at it from that perspective, the double label, social liberal, that impressed Glen Weyl so much when he came to Amsterdam first, of our party underlines that to us, to our party, markets have always been a means and never an end. And that is exactly as it should be. And as well as they may have served us on many occasions, and perhaps still are, they are also now increasingly underperforming. And so what is the challenge here? The challenge to our party is to design, to think through, and to propose ultimately political reforms that will convince the rest of the population, at least the majority among them, that markets can be properly repositioned to fully serve the cause of progress. That is what we should want. 400 years ago, the Dutch, let's remember that, were the very, very first to realize that market design really matters. Market design really can make a difference. And we owe it to our historical past to lead the way towards the future. Now, Glen Weyl's book, which you may or may not have read, contains 5 extremely clever, extremely radical proposals for redesign. And he and his co-author, and in fact he just said so, will be the first to agree that they are all of them many, many steps away from a large-scale implementation. The question is, can they serve as interesting, useful, long-term goals for reform? And let me be frank, I really have serious doubts on that dimension. And I can perhaps best illustrate these by summarize the idea from the book that has attracted the most attention. In chapter 1. In chapter 1 of that book, the authors talk about the market inefficiencies that arise out of the misallocation of assets. And sure enough, that is a source of inefficiency. But what is their remedy? The remedy is, and you heard a brief reference to it already, that they propose a self-assessment-based wealth tax with a mandatory sale at the self-assessed price. Let's just think that through for a second. It would force you, for instance, to specify the value that you attach to, say, your house, subsequently pay a wealth tax based on that value. And to give you an idea, the authors suggest a rate of about 7%. And then, and this is the interesting part, be prepared to sell to anybody who is ready to pay that price. Well, maybe you want to digest that for a second, but I think we can all agree this is really radical stuff. And as encouraging as it is that Taiwan is moving in this direction, I do not see that the Netherlands will follow suit, adopt Taiwan as its role model, and readily embrace an idea that, according to its designers, I'm quoting here from the book, might well reduce property values by, let's say, about 1/2, not a very popular proposal, and subsequently impose a capital tax, remember the 7%, that is, let's say, about twice the current capital return rate. I could be wrong, but I don't think I am. This is not going to fly very well. There are 4 more extremely clever ideas where this one came from, and we can review them later. And in fact, like the first one, they might work well in a few markets, because I actually believe that that is the case, also for the first one. But we have to really look elsewhere for broad redesign proposals, really big ones that could really help us win the next election rather than lose it up front. Now, we need to look for those proposals, and can we find them anywhere? And the happy answer is we can. We can, for example, in a recent report produced by a very active group of members of our party that call themselves the breidelaars. The breidelaars. And in case you don't immediately realize what the name stands for, it reflects their firm opposition to unbridled, ongebreideld capitalism. And I strongly, strongly recommend that report. And I've been promised it will be on an accessible website for all of you to look at it. In fact, many of the proposals from this report have already found their way into the draft D66 program for next year's election, a program that will be submitted to all of you, at least those of you who are party members, in the near future. Progressive capitalism. Progressive capitalism is a core notion from this program. And I think it is precisely the right term, the right rallying cry, if you will, for everybody who firmly believes, like I do, that it makes much more sense to try to repair capitalism than to replace it. Of course, progressive capitalism, I really like this term, it's sort of a bit provocative, exactly the right flavor. Progressive capitalism is far too big a topic for the few minutes that I have tonight. And so what I will do in the remaining part of my presentation, I will just give you a few examples. And I want to begin with one of the main issues, one of the main sources of underperformance, which is the current market's underperformance in the very important area dear to our hearts of sustainability. And I'm sure all of you will agree that this is really a big issue. Many consumers, of course, recognize its importance, the importance of sustainability, but at the same time, the crucial transformation that we all would wish for to a sustainable, truly circular economy moves ahead much, much too slowly, as indeed we all know. And one of the reasons, of course, is that in spite of all the helpful and thoughtful ecology labels and certificates, the simple one-dimensional price just continues to drive and misdirect a large part of customer behavior. The untranslatable example of the kilo knaller is irresistible to quote here. I'm happy to explain it to Glen after the session. However, in a truly progressive capitalist economy, that price would reflect all external costs, let's say environmental costs, that are imposed by the product. And of course, that principle is a very attractive and very solid one. And it is for that reason that our party was an early supporter of a serious carbon tax. That is precisely the logic of such a tax. But we all know that full and complete true pricing in this sense will take a while to develop and implement. And so in the meantime, producers will just have to take their own responsibility. And in a progressive capitalist economy, they will be put under significant pressure to do so. The good news here is that an increasing number of them already do that and respect the OECD standards for multinationals, standards that I recommend to all of you, and that in fact were largely inspired by the 2008 commitment of the Dutch business community to strive for high social and ecological standards in their complete supply chain. Complete supply chains. This is a big and really ambitious goal. But as ambitious as that goal is, it now defines the benchmark by which we can judge and should judge all OECD-based companies. And in doing that, subject them to all the public pressure that is required to secure their full compliance to these standards. That, I think, is where progress can truly be made. Further progress. One example. What other examples? What other market improvements need to be addressed? Let me give you a second category of examples. The need, for instance, to ensure proper competition. And where proper competition fails, no form of capitalism, progressive or not, can ever hope to succeed. But of course, as we all know, the signs of failures are everywhere. Not just in the enormous market powers of American and Chinese big tech players, but also, for example, in the emergence of media monopolies that threaten independent journalism. Certainly not something we welcome. So, in the reforms that we would pursue and should pursue, Dutch and European market authorities deserve and need significantly extended mandates to cope with the challenges of this new global economy that we're looking at, where a free deal does not necessarily define a good product, and where the invisible hand guiding corporate behavior is more invisible than ever. Right now, these authorities are painfully under-equipped to fight the battle for corporate transparency on our behalf, leaving consumers very poorly protected against many forms of digital exploitation. And then a third example, or rather category of examples, because we all know that purely private enterprise is not the full story. But unlike Glen Weyl, I don't believe that we should think in black and white contrasts here. Because progressive capitalism recognizes that the supply of certain vital services cannot be left to the market alone. Healthcare, electricity, public transportations, and many other examples. There is room here, as we all know, for really clever, yes, clever, tailor-made mixes of public and private mechanisms that balance high levels of public service, which is what we want, with high standards of private efficiency, which we also want. And here our country has really done quite well in many areas. The Netherlands is very often praised by outside observers for the rich variety and the quality of the outcome. But of course, that should not blind us to deficiencies in the current system. And let me just mention one of them, the way in which pharmaceutical products are developed and ultimately reach the market, which has a lot to be desired and which threatens both innovation, affordability, and also, at the end of the day, accessibility. Here we have 3 examples of badly needed reform. But of course there is much, much more. On the labor market, for instance. The labor market which ultimately, I think, defines failure or success for an economy, if it functions well or not. And which, as we all know, for the past few years has been ours to manage politically. A heroic struggle, best illustrated by the fact that our minister, Wouter Koolmees, has recently started to smoke again. It's a bad sign. I think he will be the first one to agree that the struggle is far from over. But, of course, as we all know, thanks to the report that he commissioned from Hans Borslap, we at least know where to go in rebalancing fixed and flexible labor so as to ensure decent work for all. An ambitious but important agenda. Another quick example, perhaps, the greener tax system that Menno Snell, sitting in the first row here, has worked so hard on, in which the tax rate on labor goes down as the tax rate on capital income goes up, and in which the system as a whole is redesigned to serve the cause of sustainability as much as possible. Or, final example, the consolidation of pension reform, which Wouter Koolmees, to his enormous credit, was able to realize after many, many agonizing years. And so on, and so on, and so on. There are just many opportunities here that we should seek and explore. And finally, in the briefest possible summary, what we should want to ensure is that the Netherlands recovers and strengthens its unique mix of being simultaneously one of the most competitive economies in the world and one of the most inclusive economies in the world. That is a pretty rare mixture and one that we should treasure and work on. And ladies and gentlemen, that I think is what progressive capitalism is all about. And that is what we must stand for as a party, the right mix, to ensure that people have full access to the opportunities that their talents afford to them, and to make sure that they receive full support to realize them, and in doing that, to radically, radically enrich their lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your critical reflections on the book of Glen Weyl and Eric Posner. You probably know the Dutch model of consensus decision-making better than anyone else, the poldermodel as we call it. And in the end, you did plead for radical reforms. But in how far do you think these radical reforms can be delivered by the Dutch polder model? Is the polder model capable of delivering the reforms that we need? And if it is not, or partly so, what change would we need?
The model is not designed to deliver change, because change is delivered by politics, by democratically elected politicians. So that, in a sense, is a very simple answer, but equally, I'm also convinced that the tradition of consensus and compromise, which is very close to the Dutch DNA, which has been there for not just decades, but centuries, has played a very constructive role in getting the reforms that we could manage, that were timely and appropriate. And I hope that that tradition will survive. That tradition that translates itself into a willingness to think in terms of joint interests, a tradition that has led to huge steps forward that the world has admired, huge negotiations with many, many parties involved that set the stage for reforms in domains like climate and energy, and hopefully will continue to play that role. And we have seen in recent months that if an economic crisis all of a sudden appears out of the blue, then there is still a useful role to be played for the representatives of employers and employees, trade unions, to figure out what the best solution to the crisis is. So once again, and very importantly, the decisions are not taken within that model, but to prepare for the best possible decisions and to come up with ideas that work. That is, I think, where the model and the spirit of compromise and consensus has really worked extremely well for our country.
Right. Thank you. I would like to invite you to take a seat for the Q&A. I would like to invite Mierlo Stichting on the stage again also to take a seat for our panel discussion and Q&A. And I would like to invite Glen Weyl back on the screen with us to also participate in the Q&A and session and panel discussion. I hope he is still there.
Yes, here I am.
Welcome back. Glen, welcome back. Before I open the floor for any questions from the audience, I think it would only be fair to first give you the floor again, because these were quite some critical reflections. Of course, also praise, but I heard many critical reflections on the book that you wrote and the ideas that you discussed or shared with us this evening. So I would like to extend to you the invitation to reflect a bit on that and counter some of the things that were said.
Thank you, Afka, and thanks so much to Marlene and to Alexander. This is really a wonderful set of commentaries, and I find myself in profound agreement with both of these apparently contradictory perspectives. With Marlene, I couldn't agree more that what we desperately need more than anything is to resurrect the spirit of the commons and to allow the principles of the commons to effectively offer an alternative to capitalist private property as a means of organizing not just digital spaces, but so many of the other spaces, from the public spaces of our cities to the transportation infrastructure that we share, to really almost every aspect of our economy, I would like to see organized in the spirit that Marlene highlights. I similarly profoundly agree with Alexander that there is no alternative that has proven itself capable of organizing large-scale social organization to forms of formalism, sometimes called markets, that allow us to keep track of and interact with distant people in distant lands who we don't always have the personal relationships with on which the commons of old depended. The project of the book, the project of Radical Exchange, which has gone beyond the book and which has taken very seriously many of the critiques leveled by both sides of the debate, which are all relevant and which I won't go through point by point. But the project is, how do we formalize the notion of a commons in a sharp enough way that it is capable of representing an at-scale alternative to pure private property-based systems of organization, and therefore can have the persuasiveness and broad confidence that such systems have never managed to achieve in the modern period, or we wouldn't be having this conversation in the first place. And I think that the way that that happens is by small-scale experimentation with scalable, replicable, formal rules, like is ongoing incredibly successfully in Taiwan and in Estonia and in Colorado. And those do look like market designs. And at the same time, they move us beyond what the content of standard markets holds. And I look forward to further discussion of that. I won't take up more bandwidth because I really want to hear from the audience, but I look forward to further conversation with both of the commentators, with the audience, and with your very important political party.
Thank you, Glenn. Yes, I understood that we have hundreds of viewers, both here, of course, and at home. And I received some first questions from our live stream audience, which is larger than the audience here, so I'm going to give them priority. A first question comes from Angela Welting, and I would like to direct it to Marlene because this is an issue you also discussed and raised attention for. She asks, instead of breaking up big companies, how can we democratize big multinationals and give power to their consumers or users?
Well, at first, I think they're beyond repair. So I don't think for example, Facebook now introduced the idea of a committee that looks at their way of moderating and their rules, their community rules. But again, this is a committee that's paid for by Facebook. There is no external accountability. And I think this kind of like little ways that they try to understand what's beyond, to try to change a little bit, but in the end, it's a company that doesn't obey the rule of law in Europe, in the Netherlands, and it will not do that. So I don't believe it makes any sense to try to change those companies. I think we really have to put our laws in place. And also, I think this is also something that Glenn said, we have to really push back on the extreme powers that these platforms have. Yeah. And I think that this utility platform law that Senator Warren presented looked really good. I think we need some new laws, as we have done with breaking up also the railway and also the telecom industry and those moments in history.
Yes. Glenn, are these big multinational companies beyond repair? What is your view on this?
Well, I think I agree with everything that Marlene said, except for perhaps her pessimism, which is that I actually think that if you look at the examples she gave, what we did with the rail network was not break it up. What we did with the rail network, for the most part in the most successful countries, was to turn it into a public utility. What we did with the telephone networks in the United States was not to break them up. And in fact, when we did, we found it very unsuccessful. And it just reassembled into the worst forms of monopoly. We broke it, we turned it into a utility. The fundamental problem that we face today is that our previous modes of organizing commons, of organizing utilities, were based around exclusionary nation states ruled for the white men and Asian, occasionally Asian men who were enfranchised in their early days. And as they diversified, as they became more international, as they included people from around the world, and as it became possible through things like the internet to connect people across the world, those forms of solidarity broke down. We need to ask, how can we build up a commons for this new era? And I do not believe that individual nation states, like Elizabeth Warren's bills on many topics, even though I greatly admire her, can do it on their own. They can put pressure that pushes these enterprises to realize that they'll be torn into a million pieces if they don't come up with a better model. But they can't do it on their own because we don't have international governance. And there is no entity out there that actually represents the polity that needs to be part of governing these platforms. So my hope is that in this multi-stakeholder system, the pressure from many different national governments, together with the desire to remain coherent from these companies, will push us towards a version of democratically based stakeholder capitalism that will, or I wouldn't even call it capitalism, but stakeholder democracy that can supersede our current models.
We indeed also received a question from Dan Joppe on YouTube about small states and states being able to take action on their own. And I would like to direct this one perhaps to Alexander, because Dan Joppe is asking, how can small states like the Netherlands force companies like Shell, Starbucks, or Unilever to democratize their cooperation? So what power would the Netherlands have to democratize or to force companies to democratize their operations?
I'm not I'm not sure that I fully understand what democratizing a company actually means. But the answer is not that difficult because, first of all, we define a pretty interesting market. And this is, after all, the 16th largest economy in the world. So we are a pretty interesting market on our own, and we, based on that importance and relative weight, already, I think, could have some influence on how big companies behave, at least when they're active here. But even more relevantly, and surely for this party, the obvious and natural answer is we are part of a larger whole, and that whole is called Europe. And Europe is precisely the arena where some of the first successes have been established and accomplished, for instance, when it comes to legislation and regulation that protects personal privacy. Europe really has set the standard for the rest of the world, which doesn't mean it's perfect, but at least it's something. And I think right now it's being observed and watched and largely admired, both in the United States and perhaps even secretly in China. So this is, of course, is much more Marlene's domain than mine, but I think it is a very encouraging example of what we can do if we collaborate in Europe. And the importance of collaborating at a European level, fortunately, is deep in the DNA of this party.
Would you agree, Marlene, that these European or EU initiatives are encouraging?
Yeah, and you have your party has a champion, Marietje Schaake, who is one of the very important people in the European arena to support the GDPR and privacy. And I think that at the moment, of course, I mean, unfortunately, on the national level, in my view, it lacks attention from politicians. But there's now this commission on the future of the digital future. I think that was a big step. I think something happened there. I hope it will reflect also in the next cabinets, that we will see somebody responsible for the digital arena, for the technical technology. But of course, I believe the European constellation is the right, has the right power, has the right format to do so. Also, the competition laws and the stuff that's happening there is also very important. Of Vestager, the commissioner.
Yeah. And for earlier attendees, Marietje Schaake was one of the contributors to an earlier Marchand lecture. And we have now, I think, very generously lent her to the United States, where she is active in Stanford, and I think pretty close to where Glen lives. So I strongly recommend that you benefit from her presence and get her input on American reform.
Well, but no pressure, of course. I would like to turn to the audience, and this may be a bit awkward because I learned it takes about 8 seconds to turn on the light in the audience so that I can actually see you, and 8 seconds is very long when you stand on the stage. But there you are. I would like to take 3 questions, because that's easiest in terms of the lights. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. I will point at you, and you can state your question, not too softly, because I will have to repeat it so that Glen can also hear us, but not too loudly either, because we're not allowed to shout. So who has a question? Can I see show of hands? Here is one. There is another one. I'm going to take this one first.
Thank you very much. In the discussion on the global markets, I also think we should mention the financial markets. As we all know, whereas COVID is taking businesses and lives, the global financial markets are at all-time highs. And I really wonder what you make of this paradox and what we should do to normalize the situation, especially because much of that months. So what should we do to get that market, those global financial markets, attach them more to real lives again,
Yes.
get out the funding and bring it back to the public?
Yes. What, in short, what should we do about the global financial markets?
Easy.
Small question.
Easy thing.
Thank you.
Glenn will answer that one.
I am going to take one other one so that we can dim the lights again. So what should we do about the global financial markets? We have another question up there.
Thank you very much to Glen Weyl, Alexander and Marlene for your interesting lectures. I was wondering about competition law, which is one of the most important things we as a collective, as a state have in regulating markets. But it's politically very unsexy. It's not a political issue at all, it seems. But it may be one of our only hopes. What should be done to enforce competition law more strongly and improve it? And how do we make it political?
Yes. So what do we do about the unsexiness of competition law? I'm going to take one more question. Someone upstairs? All the way up.
I found one of the most, well, to me, it was one of the most interesting ideas in the book. And also perhaps a radical idea that could be, well, not easily implemented, but would be perhaps a sexy thing on a D66 election program. So I'm just wondering his thoughts on that, and also like on the real, on the value of the idea.
Thank you. We have 3 questions. And I'm going to direct the first question about financial markets to Glen.
Could you please repeat the last question? I didn't get a chance
The
to hear
last
it.
question is about quadratic voting, and it's directed to Alexander Renoy-Khan about, well, basically what he thinks about this as an effort to democratize our society. So I'm going to ask you the first question that was asked about, well, what to do about the global financial markets.
So I would say 2 things. One question is about financial markets. The other question is about global markets. And I think that they're related, but a bit distinct. I think we saw during the crisis of 2008, the way in which the innovation of financial derivatives became essentially a way of stoking speculation that actually increased risk within the financial system. And I think that the innovation there, as Paul Volcker said, is not added very much to the economy. So I think, and this is an area again where I tend to agree with Elizabeth Warren, that we need to fundamentally reconsider the principle of just allowing new financial derivatives to be innovated and protected contractually. I think we need to instead have more of a precautionary principle where we only allow new financial derivatives once they've passed some form of pre-approval based on whether they actually will allow risks to be mitigated rather than increased. But in terms of global markets, I actually think COVID offers a fascinating opportunity. So much of global trade and travel has broken down. It will have to be reconstituted. And as we've seen in recent years, nationalists have emphasized that global markets push around countries and have very little governance. And I think that that's correct. I don't think the solution is protectionism or to break the incredible dynamism that international trade has allowed and the inclusion that it's allowed for people in the developing world. However, we must constitute international governance to go in parallel with international trade and international capital flows. Without governance, dealing with issues like research and development, sanitation, we will face catastrophe after catastrophe, whether it be climate change or pandemics, as a result of our inability to substitute for the roles that nation states are no longer able to fill in a globalized world.
Would any of you like to respond to these statements about the financial market?
Maybe one, a small one, is that the same problem that we have with everything which is algorithmic, and the black box in technology also counts, of course, for financial markets. So if we say that we want to have an open, accountable digital sphere, that also is the same claim that we have for the financial markets. So a lot of how financial markets are run right now, so a lot of people don't even understand it. So we need much more education on how it works. I think one of the interesting things that happened over the years is that people started to understand what money creation is. It's not being taught in school, so we just think money comes from somewhere, and now people start to understand it's a bit more complicated, which is like a first step in trying to understand how financial markets work and what the role of banks is and how money is being created. And it's not the government that is creating the money and other. So there's a lot of things that we still are very not educated in this sphere. So we have to learn from it. But I think everything that is algorithmic should be open and accountable, which also means that large parts of what banks are doing at the moment and financial institutions should be opened.
We have two major questions still. One about the sexiness of competition laws.
One thing in response to Marleen. I would love to have a discussion at some other point about algorithmics and about what it means to have open and accessible algorithms. Sort of an area that I worked in myself, and to me it doesn't seem as easy as it sounds. But I would also like to emphasize that if the past weeks or month tell us anything, it is that the connection between financial markets and the real economy is pretty tenuous. And there's a famous saying that says that financial markets have correctly predicted 9 of the most 5 recent recessions, which sums it up rather nicely. The connection is very weak. And so, whether we like it or not, the mechanisms that we put in place that do not rely on algorithmics alone have taken us away from the real economy and in a very different direction, whether we like it or not. And I don't see an easy reform to repair that.
I'm going to jump to the topic of the competition laws. And I wanted to address it to you, as it is about politics and making competition laws a political subject again. How would we put that on the agenda?
It's a very good example, I think, of a reform that is very badly needed and that is entirely in the hands of the democratic systems. First of all, national, and in our case also European. So this is not something elusive. It's something that we can do if we really want it and if we have majority support to do it. And what do we want to accomplish? Well, it's a pretty long list. And again, let me refer you to the report of the Bereidelaars, which has a very nice chapter on competition. But to me, one of the important recommendations from that chapter is perhaps first and foremost to rethink the notion of market power. That, of course, is what competition law is all about, to make sure that we properly constrain market power. But how do we measure it? And how do we convince ourselves we don't like what we see? Of course, in many of those debates, the big tech companies can claim with some justification that what they do is deliver the lowest possible price for the customers. And by some standards, that is enough to safeguard them against this kind of criticism. But we all know and understand and feel it's only part of the story. So we should rethink market power in its full breadth, in its multi-dimensional sense, and make sure that we establish additional mechanisms, additional power in the hands of the market authorities to make sure that they can hold the larger companies, especially the larger multinational companies, accountable for what they do to customers in each individual marketplace. And that is, I think, a very feasible program of reform, because the only condition that applies is that we need a sufficient political majority to get it going.
Yes. I wanted to, I'm going to jump to a different subject as I see we have little time left, and I wanted to ask Glen.
Should I answer the quadratic voting question?
Well, I wanted to ask Glen, but I don't know if he's still here, if he can elaborate a little bit on what that actually means, what his proposal is about on quadratic voting. But do we still have Glen? No? Okay, yeah. Then I'm going to give the floor to Alexander to comment on this question from the third.
The question was addressed to me. Very briefly, what quadratic voting is.
Thank you.
It's, again, a very clever idea. And the idea is you get a number of, let's call them credits every year, every citizen, equal amount. Let's say 10 or 20, doesn't really matter. And then what you can do is when there are votes in elections, or maybe more interestingly, certainly for this party, in referendums, what you can do is wait for the right occasion and then cast as many votes as you want, yes, either in favor or against, and pay for these votes using the credits that you have assembled over time.
Exactly.
But pay quadratically. That is where the term comes from. So if you cast one vote, you pay 1 credit, mm-hmm, 2 votes cost 4 credits, 3 votes cost 9 credits, and so on. Yes. So is this a clever idea? Absolutely. Is it realistic? Maybe in a limited setting, I can imagine that. But frankly, I don't see it happen at a national level, if only for the fact that the cognitive load on voters is pretty high. Because every year you have to figure out if you're going to use up your credits. You have to anticipate if you think a more important vote is coming along next year, or maybe the year after. Mm-hmm. And so I find it rather hard on citizens to make that assessment and be happy Democrats at the end of the day. So again, I think very clever, very radical, but not very realistic.
Perhaps that was a sign that we should also move to Marleen. I have another question for you, but perhaps you... hello, Glen, welcome back. Yes, Alexander just explained what quadratic voting means. I can see you're talking, but we can't hear you yet, so I'm going to move to Marleen. Would you like to comment on the quadratic voting proposal?
Maybe 2 things. One, I think the earlier question was that competition is not sexy. I think it's very sexy. It's just it's just the narrative around it. So fighting against Facebook and Google, it's quite an interesting narrative. And the Europe that's big and strong and stands for certain public values, and I think so there is a very good narrative, and I believe you can make it very, very, very sexy even. Mm-hmm. So a very strong, politician that stands up for our rights. So I don't see the problem there, especially not in the digital domain towards the tech giants and so on. On the voting, the explanation was was one of the best explanations I ever heard. Thank you for that. My problem is that it is being described again as a sort of like a marketplace of votes, and I believe that as I already said, I'm very worried about defining everything as a market and use the language of markets. Yes. So also in voting, I would not refer to credits and so on. I think it's the wrong type of language for something that is so basically in expressing your democratic rights. So I rather, maybe that's then I'm too that I should go beyond the terminology. And then I, of course, understand that we should not have only one vote in the 4 years, and that there should be other types of participation and so on.
Yes. Glen, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about why you opted for that language of the market and the marketplace and credits when it comes to voting also.
So one thing I find very interesting about conversations with people who often imagine themselves on the left is that there's a long history of focus on sort of Hegelian synthesis of bringing together opposite perspectives. That's something I take very seriously myself. And I think it's really critical that if we are going to put forward commons models, that they also speak to the principles of markets that they help supplant. Only by making a true synthesis of these currently opposite perspectives do we have any chance of, getting beyond the current divisions that stop us from making the progress that we need to make. So this is why I think quadratic voting has, perhaps contra Alexander's perspective, made so much progress on the ground with political parties around the world, with helping to reshape Taiwan's digital democracy, to help build commons, to help build common pool resources like open source software, and why it's such an exciting democratic experiment for people around the world, because it actually helps us bridge those apparently opposite perspectives.
Yes.
And I think similarly, as we need to bring markets into democracy, we also need to bring democracy into markets. And I think that's really what's missing from the discussion on competition policy. The original purpose of competition policy was to democratize power, market power, and it's instead turned into a technocratic exercise in just in a very economistic way, measuring things and doing business transactions.
Yes.
Instead, it has to be a process of actually involving people as new polities to democratize the companies that gain power over them.
Thank you, Glenn. I notice it's 9:30 already, and I want to address one more question from the live stream audience, and this one comes from Karin. And she is asking, can a basic income, and I know that's a topic of discussion also within D66, can a basic income help to remodel the capitalist system and help organize the commons that Marlene has been talking about? So I would like to address this one to Marlene first.
Yeah, I realized that in the 80s, when I grew up or was entering coming from my studying and then entering the world, there were no jobs. I was like the no future generation, so there were no jobs. So we had a sort of a basic income, which was the uitkering, and that didn't slow us down. We were very, very active, and we built stuff, and we started to sort of reorganize the city, which was at that moment, like Amsterdam, was really like a wasted. So a lot of value has been created in those times by people that had a basic income. So I believe it can be very freeing for people to have this. I also believe it can help us to get out of this strange, I refer to the human capital, that people are educated for the workforce, so that they, and when they're very young, they're already being asked, like, what are you going to do, for whom are you going to work? Which is not how they want to, if we have to change the world, if these next generations have to figure out how to do things differently, they should not end up too early in companies that don't change. So I think it will have this radical revolutionary potential if we give the next generation some time to figure out what kind of companies they want to make, and not just give them as like the new capital for companies that are extractive and don't take a planet serious.
Yes. Glenn, you also describe a sort of basic revenue. You don't call it an income, a basic revenue in the book you wrote with Eric Posner. What will be the difference between a basic income and this revenue that you discussed, if there is any?
I've come to be quite skeptical of both the basic revenue and the basic income. And as before, I find myself in profound agreement with Marlene's goals, and yet quite skeptical of her particular means in this case. The problem that I have with basic income is actually precisely the same as the fear that Marlene has of what would happen if we don't have it, which is that basic income is not actually directly giving income to people. Income doesn't do anything for people. Money is a fiction. People consume services together, and the only way they can use their money to buy services is to buy it from monopolistic companies, which dominate our capitalist economy. the way that we truly free labor from the need to serve the capitalist machine is the way they've done it in Scandinavia, which is not primarily through income transfers, but rather through the provision of public goods collectively through a variety of different communities. So that, to me, is the fundamental problem with universal basic income. It is not actually the freedom that it appears, because freedom comes through community. Freedom doesn't come through money to be spent in a marketplace which is allegedly free, but actually dominated by monopolies.
I hear some applause. I don't know if you can hear it, Glenn, but some people are applauding this statement here.
Thank you.
Undoubtedly, Alexander also wants to say something about the basic income.
And I'm happy to end the evening with agreeing at least in one thing with Glenn, but for different reasons. Because what Marlene is describing is not basic income at all, it's welfare. And as you well remember, one of the conditions on which you receive it is that you look for a job. A basic income is really very different. It's something that goes to everybody, whether you need it or not. And the interesting conclusion that you can draw right away, this is not a very complex computation, is that even if you think it's the greatest idea since sliced bread, it is also completely and totally unaffordable, because it goes to so many people who don't really need it. So as much as I am sorry to disappoint its fans and admirers, a basic income, universal basic income, is just not for even this wealthy economy, let alone for the many poorer ones. There are much cleverer ideas to help people along, of course, because they need to be helped, but then you need to help people who really need it. For instance, negative income tax is, I think, a very clever idea that is much more affordable, which I think has to some extent been tried in a number of locations. Now, there is a route that we could probably go to. So let's explore that, but let's shed the illusion that universal basic income is a doable thing for the Netherlands.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask you all a final question about the upcoming elections in March, after which political parties will have to negotiate a new coalition agreement amongst themselves, and D66 might be or might not be one of those political parties at the table. But very briefly, if you can, in 1 minute, could you summarize, if you would sit at that table drafting the new coalition agreement between political parties for the next government, as is common in European parliamentary systems, Glenn, as you undoubtedly know. If you were to sit at that table drafting the agreement, what would be the one paragraph about uprooting capitalism that you would add to that agreement? I would like to first give the floor to Marlene. I know it's a difficult question and I'm putting you on the spot.
Well, I would like it to be, I think what's in the book, and what we just discussed a lot about is the whole notion of commons, the constitution of commons. And I would like to have a minister of commons, probably, that can rethink economic models according to this notion of shared resources, both in the digital as in the physical domain.
Democratic reform and progressive capitalism to transform markets so as they can fully serve the cause of progress across the board. That is what I would do.
Thank you. Glenn, if you were Dutch and part of us, and you would sit at that table drafting the next coalition agreement, if we were to sit at that table, what would you add to it?
Bring democracy to the heart of markets by democratizing and making commons all the scaled activities we do together, and bring markets to the heart of democracy by making them far more competitive, far more flexible, and far more participatory than existing democratic systems are.
Applause.
I hope you can hear the applause, Glenn.
Yes, I'm very honored.
I'm going to close this evening, I want to extend a very big thank you to Glen. So perhaps we can have one more round of applause. And a very, very big thank you also to our great discussants, Mierlo Stichting and Alexander Renoykan. So this was the 10th Marchand lecture. We have a present for our speakers, but given COVID restrictions, I cannot hand it over to you, but it will be at your seats. And of course, Glen, I cannot reach across the Atlantic either, but there is a present and it's on its way to you. Should you want, and you at the live stream, want to keep up to date with the Mierlo Foundation, do follow us on one of the big tech giants' Twitter. We also have a book stand here just outside. Then I have two very important announcements to make. The first one is about drinks. You are all very welcome to join us for drinks, to have a drink at the bar. But do note that due to COVID restrictions, corona regulations, you can only consume your drink while seated. So please bear this in mind. Second, very important announcement to make is about how we exit this area. We will do this a bit like on an airplane, which means row by row. We will start with the downstairs area and the last row. You leave the area first, and then we move all the way up to the front. Then we do the same with the first balcony, and afterwards we do the same with the second balcony. I hope that's all clear to you. This is a very weird way of rounding off an evening with COVID instructions again. A big thank you once more, and perhaps we can have one more round of applause for the speakers.